The 90s was the era of the pay driver, a driver who was on the grid simply because he brought a lot of money with him, and usually the amount of money didn't correlate to the amount of talent that a driver had. So as a result, during the 1990s we saw some of the biggest meme drivers in Formula 1 history. Marco Apicella, or is it Apicella or maybe even Apicella, who drove for Jordan in the 1993 season, holds the distinction of having the shortest career in Formula 1 history. Now, I appreciate that the picture being used here isn't of Marco, but it's a 1993 Jordan, so close enough. At the Italian Grand Prix, Apicella, I do not know how to pronounce the name, made it barely 500 yards, being involved in a collision at the first of the two opening chicanes, as was back then before they changed it to the one that we now see in 2000. After that, he never raced in Formula 1 again. But I suppose Eddie got paid, so every cloud and all that. Then we get into 1994, and the merry-go-round of drivers towards the end of that season has been documented in its own dedicated video, because the whole situation was just insane. And there was also the fact that not many teams used the same drivers all year, because, as we are well aware, 1994 was a season of injuries and worse, and then several teams towards the end of the season were doing whatever they could simply to survive. And by the time the season ended, LaRousse and Lotus were gone. In that period towards the end of the 1994 season, a slew of drivers came through. Taki Inui, Jean-Denis Delatraz, Hideki Noda, Domenico Sciattarella and Frank Lagorce, or Lagorque, I don't speak French. But these drivers made the grid simply because they were paying, with Noda and Inui getting drives because they were being fielded at the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka. Delatraz achieved notoriety during the final Grand Prix of that season in Adelaide through qualifying 25th and was then 26th and last by the end of the first lap. By the time he retired on lap 57, he'd been lapped 10 times. He was not experienced in single-seaters or aero cars whatsoever, and his fitness was nowhere near the level it should have been either. As a result, he was lapping 6 seconds a lap slower than the leaders and about 2 seconds slower than the car immediately in front of him. Put simply, he was slow. Jonathan Palmer, who was commentating on the BBC at the time, said, "Yes, Delatraz really having no business in Formula 1 and demonstrating it there. He's spending all of his modest effort, frankly, keeping the car on the road. He's holding up Gerhard Berger there, who has now lost a second on Nigel Mansell. This is, I'm afraid, one of the problems of the Grand Prix season. At the end of the year, we do get 1 or 2 drives being taken by people who have got more money than talent, and that's one example of it." Now, to be fair to Delatraz, he did achieve 2 class wins at Le Mans in 2001 and 2002, so maybe he just wasn't cut out for open wheelers. But because of Delatraz and some of the lads coming through around 1994 and 1995, for 1996 the FIA introduced the 107% qualifying rule, which was referred to in the media as the Delatraz rule. And also in 1996, a new rookie joined the grid, Ricardo Rosset. Rosset was another one of the South Americans who seemed to be filling the junior categories in the 90s. The Ayrton Senna effect? I'm not sure. But when you look at the fact that you had the likes of Barrichello, Fittipaldi, Diniz, Gil de Ferran, Andre Ribeiro and so on come through in that period, it was almost like the British invasion at Indianapolis in the mid to late 60s. And Brazil was producing some half-decent drivers at the time. And it's good to see after 8 years or so we do have a Brazilian in F1 again, full-time that is, in Bortoleto. It has to be said that Ricardo was a bit of a late bloomer when it came to racing. He didn't start karting until he was 21, being able to do so because his family owns a successful bikini and female underwear business. But that said, he wasn't exactly a slouch. He could wheel, he was pretty average, and like we saw with Damon Hill, it would have been interesting to see what he might have been able to do if he'd started a little bit earlier. His karting career is a little scarce in terms of finding the results. What I did find is that he was 4th in the Brazilian series and then moved to Brazilian Formula Ford in 1991 before he moved to Europe. Now, how he actually ended up in Europe to start with is also a little bit vague, but he'd gone from the Formula Opel Euro series in 1992 into the British Formula 3 series in time for 1993, coming 6th, and being tied on points with Pedro de la Rosa. His best finish was a 2nd place at Silverstone. Now, finishing down in 20th place that season was some guy called Christian Horner, but Horner did come 2nd in Class B, otherwise known as the National Class. But the following year, in 1994, his results improved. He went from 6th up to 5th. Now you might be thinking, wow, he improved by 1 whole place. But if you look here, he was just 1 point behind future 4-time IndyCar champion and 3-time Indy 500 winner Dario Franchitti. But overall, winning anything was going to be tricky, because Jan Magnussen had utterly dominated the season, winning all but 3 races he finished and smashed the entire grid to take a very easy championship victory. Horner, if you were wondering, was 17th, but Rosset's performance had seen him score nearly 120 points more compared to the previous season, and he'd won a race. It was a race Magnussen retired from, but a win's a win. Now actually, he'd qualified on pole for that race at Snetterton and recorded the fastest lap. So to say he only won because Jan the man retired is copium at best. So the next logical step was to go up into Formula 3000, which was later GP2 and now Formula 2. And it was called Formula 3000 because they used 3-litre engines, well, 3000cc engines. And at the time, it was the stepping stone into Formula 1. Much like it is now, come to think of it. In that season, Rosset had joined the Supernova racing team. Also on the grid in terms of names you might recognise were Kenny Brack, Tarso Marques, Alan McNish and Jan Lammers, the latter of which had already had a brief spell in Formula 1. I say brief, it started in 1979 and then went up to 1992, driving on and off for a few teams. And in 1994, Lammers had driven the iconic Volvo estate in the British Touring Car Championship. So for a so-called junior series, Lammers was racing in that series at nearly 40 years old. That would be like having Jerome D'Ambrosio entering Formula 2 today, or maybe even Bruno Senna. His teammate for the year was Vincenzo Sospiri, and the two of them were the championship contenders for the most part. And Supernova, given the name because they were sponsored by the Nova chain of Japanese English schools, were going to be the top team in the category over the next few years. Over the course of the 8-race season, Rosset scored 29 points to Sospiri's 42, although Sospiri was expected to do better given that he had more experience. But Rosset was the runner-up, beating the likes of Kenny Brack and Alan McNish. Sospiri went to Benetton in 1996 to be their test driver simply because there was a lack of seats available, so he went to Benetton to be the test driver and get some Formula 1 experience doing that, and then maybe move into Formula 1 later on. Meanwhile, Rosset, who had got a lot of money with him, was picked up by Jackie Oliver's Footwork team. Rosset, making his debut in Formula 1, would be partnered with Jos Verstappen, and Verstappen was back in Formula 1 full-time after only doing 5 races in the 1995 season because the team he'd been driving for in Simtech had collapsed around the time of the Monaco Grand Prix. At the same time, Verstappen was looking to prove himself in Formula 1 because Flavio Briatore had farmed him out to Simtech in 1995 to try and get the crash out of him. But it was a new start for Jos and a chance for Rosset to get some experience. And yes, he did have a lot of money behind him and he was easily able to buy a seat in Formula 1, but there was still a modicum of talent there. But the problem was, any driver like Rosset coming into the sport, much like Pedro Diniz had done the previous year, there was always going to be the Delatraz tag about them, because Delatraz, Inouye, guys like that were still fresh in people's memory. So everybody was labelled as being crap just because they had money. But there was an problem. The Footwork FA17 wasn't exactly great, and Arrows was struggling on the money front. Early in the 1996 season, the team was bought by Tom Walkinshaw, and maybe I do need to do a video on all the pies Tom had his fingers in during the 90s to see if maybe he spread himself a bit too thin in that time, but that's one to look at later on. Because of the purchase of the Arrows team, there had been this massive write-off for the 1996 season. Verstappen had been quite competitive early doors. In the pouring rain in Brazil, he had set the fastest lap at one point and then scored his only point of the season in Argentina, which was the following round of the season. Rosset, meanwhile, had managed to finish 9th out of 11 finishes in Australia, which was a pretty decent debut. In Brazil, he spun off, but several drivers did that, including Jacques Villeneuve, because it was pissing it down, so that's forgiven. But in Argentina, he lost his oil pump. At the Nürburgring, the 4th round of the season, he was a solid 11th given the performance of the car, but he inherited that position because the 2 Tyrrells were disqualified. But then he suffered a string of retirements, 4 in a row. Verstappen, meanwhile, suffered 6 in a row. At Imola, he's listed as having his engine go on Wikipedia, but in reality, Verstappen had pitted and then left the pit box while the fuel hose was still attached, and they couldn't service the 2 cars after that, so Ricardo was withdrawn. At Monaco, he crashed, but find me somebody who didn't crash that day. Alesi, Hill and Deniz were the only ones who didn't, for reference, and Rosset had done better than Verstappen there because Jos thought it would be a great idea to start the race on slicks and then stuffed it into the barrier at turn 1. At Spain, he was involved in the start line pile-up triggered by cars being blindsided by Schumacher's slow starting Ferrari. And then at Montreal, he collided with Katayama at the chicane. So I guess it depends on how you look at things. I'd say 2 of those crashes are forgivable, the Monaco and Spain ones. It has to be said though that Rosset did finish more races in 1996 compared to Verstappen, 8 to Jos's 4, and in total he would have scored 8 points if in 1996 they used the same point system as they do now. That would have been a pretty decent return given how bad that Footwork car was back then. But because of the write-off that Walkinshaw had done for 1996, it meant that Rosset was the clear number 2 driver. Not only this, Alan Jenkins went on gardening leave because he was going to go to Stewart for 1997. Walkinshaw had dumped all of his resources into the 1997 season, designing a brand new car that was completely different to what had come before, and if I can, I'll rig up a way of demonstrating the 2 cars side by side, and was also one of the teams that would be getting Bridgestone tyres, along with Prost, Minardi, Stewart and Lola for 1997. Because Arrows was doing a lot of testing with Bridgestone, they weren't doing much for the 1996 car. So basically what was happening was Jos was getting all the best parts and all the attention, and that's because Verstappen was simply faster. That's completely normal. Jos outqualified the Brazilian at every single race, and Rosset, when he finished, was able to salvage some results by simply bringing the car home while Jos couldn't seem to, at least by just a quick glance at the results. But in Japan, Ricardo was given a stop-go for ignoring blue flags, something that he maintains was not his fault. But by the end of the season, the Footwork was probably the slowest car on the grid. Even Minardi had overtaken them. So his first season in Formula 1 was okay. I mean, there were a few rookie errors, which is natural, but it wasn't a terrible season, all things considered. You know, that FA17 wasn't the best car on the grid by any stretch. It was mid to back of grid and then back of grid by the time the season ended. But for 1997, he was going off to a new team, Lola, where he'd be partnered with his old mate, Vincenzo Sospiri. It was a shambles. I've done the Lola story before, so you can go and watch that for more info, but the car was rushed into Formula 1 in 1997 due to pressure from title sponsor MasterCard. MasterCard, in turn, was sponsoring the team almost on a commission basis, with Lola being paid based off how many people signed up to a credit card that was a promotional job for the Formula 1 team. As a result, the car had the aerodynamic properties of late 90s John Goodman and missed the 107% cutoff by a country mile in Melbourne. 12.7 seconds of Villeneuve's pole time, which, alright, was a monster lap. So we'll take it from Frenson's time, which was still nearly 11 seconds off the pace. Times that hadn't been seen since the early part of the decade. After just one race weekend, Lola folded, and Rosset was searching for another drive. In 1998, he would get that drive, but his appointment caused so much division, the guy whose name was written on the car quit the team in disgust. In late 1997, Ken Tyrrell had finally realised the writing was on the wall and sold his beloved team to British American Tobacco, who were going to rename the team British American Racing for 1999. But Ken was still there, despite not owning the team anymore. And not really wanting to spend their own money and rather spend somebody else's money, BAT decided to hire Rosset in addition to newcomer Toranosuke or Tora Takagi, just to maximise the team's budget. Now Ken, meanwhile, wanted Verstappen in the car. Jos had managed to drag the uncompetitive Tyrrell with its V8 to some decent positions over the course of 1997, even if he didn't score any points. Verstappen's best result had been 8th in the pouring rain in Monaco, which, funnily enough, is, well, what you're looking at right now. Tyrrell had also scored 2 points that season, those 2 points coming from Mika Salo scoring a 5th place finish at the same Monaco Grand Prix. But Mika had gone to Arrows, so Ken was hoping for one money driver and one driver that could drag the car to be knocking on the door of points and maybe even taking points if results went the right way. But the BAR consortium overruled him and they hired Rosset instead of Verstappen, and Ken was so incensed by this decision he quit the team before the season had even started. Rosset, meanwhile, had done a couple of rounds of Porsche Super Cup in the interim, so was a bit out of practice, and Tyrrell was not the sort of team to be able to do a lot of testing. Testing would come whenever testing came. And not only this, the car wasn't particularly great and had an underpowered Ford V10. Stewart also had a Ford V10, but theirs was newer and had a lot more power. It's said that the Tyrrells would leave the pits a little ahead of the Stewarts, and the Tartan Fords would pass them within a couple of corners. That's how big the power deficit was. Now, the Tyrrell 026, the final ever Tyrrell Formula 1 car, was a looker by all accounts. But that's all it had going for it, because Rosset would be the only driver that season to fail to meet the 107% criteria, and he'd do so on a total of 4 occasions. Later, 5, but we'll get to that in a bit. Those occasions being in Spain, where he missed out by less than a tenth, Germany, where he crashed the car and couldn't take part in qualifying because Professor Watkins told him not to do qualifying, and then there was Hungary, where he was off by about 3/4 of a second, and then Monaco, where he missed the cut by around 4 tenths, while being 1.7 seconds off Tyrrell's Minardi. Speaking of Monaco, that's probably the bit you're here for, isn't it? Now, a lot of people here are really debating whether Ricardo Rosset is Formula 1 material. It's a fairly short debate, Murray. That being Martin Brundle with his ultra-cold roast of the Tyrrell driver at that particular Grand Prix weekend. Not only did he fail to make the 107% cut-off, during practice for that Grand Prix, he'd collided with Villeneuve in the second session by cutting across the Williams while JV was inside him, and then had another embarrassing moment later on. He'd spun at the second part of the swimming pool, which is the same spot he'd wiped Villeneuve out, and in a bid to flick the car back round, he'd driven straight on and got his car wedged in a gap in the barrier that was used to allow marshals to get onto the circuit. Because he'd destroyed a front wing that Tyrrell couldn't really afford to replace or evolve and made a total hash of things, the mechanics found his paddock scooter and swapped the R and the T around so it spelled the word tosser. It's British slang, you might want to look it up. So it seemed that all that stuff he'd done in the juniors that made him look semi-competent was now being undone. At Spa, he was a victim of the massive pile-up in the wet, but this one was definitely his own doing. While the massive crash triggered by Coulthard was happening, Ricardo had failed to slow down for it all and ended up ploughing into the already trashed cars and destroyed his in the process. Now, he claims he didn't see the accident developing and had no time to react, hitting the crashed cars at a rate of knots. But Tyrrell in the Minardi, who was behind him, had slowed down for it, and as a result, Tyrrell was the only person behind Coulthard, with the exception of the 2 Jordans, to escape that accident in one piece. But among this, he was able to salvage some okay results. At Canada, he equalled his best ever result of 8th, he then got a 12th in Austria, albeit 2 laps down, and was 12th in Monza. And there was the opportunity to end the season on a high at Tyrrell's final ever race, and in front of the team sponsors, PIAA. But to keep things in line with everything else that's been going on through 1998, he wasn't able to. The story goes he tweaked his neck on the roller coaster at the theme park next to the track, and that was what did it. Other reports say it was a practice crash that tweaked his neck. Maybe the story of the roller coaster has become one of those urban myths given how mental that season was. But either way, he missed out on the Japanese Grand Prix by just over 2 tenths, but was nearly 7 seconds off Schumacher's pole time. Rosset believes that Takagi got all the attention because he was a Honda driver and the new BAR team wanted to attract attention from Honda. Honda would indeed join up with BAR, but not for another 2 years. But for Rosset though, it was the end of his Formula 1 career. He apparently had looked at joining either Stewart, BAR or Sauber in 1999, but Diniz went to Sauber instead. There are also claims he was looking at Williams, but because of the Schumacher-Frentzen swap and the deal with Frank and Ganassi, that was never going to happen, other than maybe getting a test driver role. After the F1 dream ended, he went into the sportswear industry and now owns his old Tyrrell and Footwork cars as a memento of his F1 career. But while we're here, check this out. I know we like to meme on Rosset, but despite not qualifying on 5 occasions through that 1998 season, Rosset was not last in the standings. He beat Takagi because his best result was better than Tora's, and in turn, Rosset's best result was better than the one achieved by Olivier Panis in the Prost, who also scored no points through that season. Maybe Panis would have got a result at Spa, who knows, but he's listed as a did not start because both Prosts were totaled and Alain gave the spare car to Trulli instead. Ah, spare cars, what a time to be alive that was. I mean, there is Verstappen there as well, but Verstappen didn't do the full season. But then again, the engine in that Stewart was made of papier-mâché. The old F1 Rejects site described him as being obscure before his career, and that he wasn't exactly the next Senna. And like mentioned, he had come into racing quite late, being in his 20s. But unlike Damon Hill, who also started car racing in his 20s, Ricardo didn't have talents handed down from his famous racing dad to help him. It also didn't help that in his career he drove for 3 teams that financially were just utterly ruined. Footwork was there in 1996 as a formality, focusing on 1997 under new owners. 1997, he was at a Lola team with a car that not even Max Verstappen would have got on the grid, and in 1998, he was in a Tyrrell team that was on its last legs, and he hadn't driven a Formula 1 car in, well, about a year, which may have resulted in amateur hour at Monaco that weekend. Which does seem a shame because during 1996 he had shown flashes of what he probably could do. If he'd had a longer career, he might have just been another Deniz, mid-grid at best, and had enough money to be able to get himself into mid-grid drives and sort of help those mid-grid teams develop and stay competitive compared to the rest of the teams around them, if you follow. But when you're at 3 back-of-the-grid teams who were all down on their luck at the time, what else are you supposed to do? But as always, answers on a postcard. So then, a look at the life and times of Ricardo Rosset, a man who has become a bit of a meme in the time between leaving Formula 1 and now, despite having quite the anonymous career in the category. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do leave a like on this video so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine folk over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help out with keeping the lights on around here or contributing to the picture purchasing piggy bank, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or the super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.